Colin is the director of Nationhood Lab at the Pell Center for International Relations at Public Policy at Salve Regina University, which delivers more effective tools with which to describe and defend American liberal democratic tradition and better understand and defeat the forces that would undermine it. He is the New York Times bestselling author of 6 books, including American Nations, American Character, and Union. As such, he is a leading authority on North American regionalism and the challenges to constructing and maintaining a U.S. peoplehood. A longtime foreign correspondent of the Christian Science Monitor, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, Colin covered the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, ethnic conflict in the Balkans, war crimes in The Hague, and climate change in the Antarctic. He has covered Congress, the rise and fall of authoritarian-minded populist governor, and the struggles of Maine's indigenous people to secure their rights. While a staff writer for the Portland Press-Herald, he won a George Polk Award and was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize. His work has been featured by CNN, the BBC, MSNBC, PBS, NPR, The Economist, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Guardian, and Politico, where he is currently a contributing writer. He also inspired a primetime NBC drama about pirates and a video game based on his book about pirates. A graduate of Tufts University and the University of Chicago, he is a past Pew Fellow and International Journalism at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and a Fellow of the Royal Geographic Society in London. He lives right here in Freeport, Maine. Please join me in welcoming Colin Woodard for his lecture, Uniting a Divided America.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here in Portland and especially here at the University of New England. I've been a great fan of the university for some time. I used to live in the early aughts. My wife and I's first home was right across Stevens Avenue, and my wife is a graduate of this institution's Master's in Social Work program. So I guess we're sort of a UNE family in a sense. I'm also pleased to be here as a guest of the Center for Global Humanities because the humanities and liberal arts are often under attack as somehow being irrelevant, and I want to defend it as a walking, talking liberal arts, application person here. Thank you. I was trained as a historian. I was in Eastern Europe and the Balkans for most of my 20s. My first book was on the environmental crisis in the world's oceans. I have a master's degree in international relations, and I'm a member of the Royal Geographical Society, but people call me all the time to talk about the history of Blackbeard and the Golden Age pirates. And the 18 peer-reviewed academic journal articles that my team's put together in the past year and a half have all been in journals of cardiology, medicine, and public health. So I don't say that to brag, but to say in this world where it's a complex world and we need lots of people with in-depth vertical knowledge, but we also need people who have the skills to do the horizontal connecting between them, and nothing like the humanities and liberal arts gives you those skills, and they're desperately needed. So don't cut back on those, everybody. Today I run Nationhood Lab, where I study and write about the problems of United States nationhood and how to solve for them. And I want to share 2 things with you today on the state of US politics and society and how the stability of our democracy here in the midst of a frighteningly high-stakes election year at a time when the United States' revolutionary experiment in democratic self-government remains imperiled to a degree not seen since the 1860s. Those 2 things are, first, an explanation for why the United States, despite its myriad advantages, is, and for much of its existence has, been divided against itself, and thus vulnerable to collapse. And then secondly, to draw your attention to a key stratagem we've been working on at Nationhood Lab that can help hold us together against the forces of autocracy that threaten to bring down the Republic and shatter the Union. Now, I'll discuss more about that part in a few minutes. But to really understand the situation today, I want to offer what I hope will be some very helpful, deep background information on the fundamental characteristics of the United States, characteristics that make this country more structurally vulnerable than many of its liberal democratic peers. Now, first among these is that the United States isn't really a nation state at all. We're a collection of stateless nations, each with their own intents, ideals, and story of national purpose. These regional cultures, which don't reflect state or even international boundaries, have never been in agreement over the big questions. What's the proper relationship between the church and state? What's the proper role of government? What's the meaning even of such key words in the American lexicon as freedom or liberty? These stateless nations, these regional cultures, go way back to the beginning of European conquest and settlement, to the 17th and early 18th centuries. The original clusters of colonies were settled by people from distinct regions of the British Isles and from France and the Netherlands and Spain, each with their own religious and political and ethnographic characteristics. Each was first colonized at a separate time and under a different political model. Some championed individualism, others utopian social reform. Some embraced an explicit Anglo-Protestant identity, others ethnic and religious pluralism. Some valued equality and democratic participation, others deference to an aristocratic order modeled on the slave states of classical antiquity. The Puritan project in New England had little in common with the neo-feudal aristocratic society of the Chesapeake country, or with the Dutch commercial colony encompassing what's now greater New York City, or New Spain's far-flung northern frontier, or the West Indies slave society planted in the deep southern lowlands by English planters from Barbados. For generations, these discrete Euro-American cultures developed in remarkable isolation from one another, consolidating their own cherished principles and fundamental values, and expanding across the eastern half of the continent in nearly exclusive settlement bands. They saw themselves as competitors for land, for settlers, for capital, and even as enemies, taking opposing sides in the English Civil War of the 1640s, in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and of course, the US Civil War. Here, by the way, is a map of the Spanish colonization of the Southwest. These are the areas in bold that were actually effectively settled by New Spain prior to the US annexations in the early 19th century. But the point is that there's never been an America, but rather several Americas. And there are 11 today. To see their effect, you have to use county-level data because the settlement streams didn't respect state boundaries, and often places were settled before the state boundaries were even created. Now, there isn't time to describe each of these to you now, but suffice to say, they've always been divided on the key issues, with profound effects for American history and society. Now, before we proceed, just a quick word on what this map represents. These are settlement patterns like you saw on the previous slide. So to illustrate what you're seeing, say, in Yankeedom in dark blue up there, right, that colonization project started with the Winthrop fleet coming in the 1630s to Massachusetts Bay. They landed there. There were people, Calvinists, who believed that they were a covenanted people like the Old Testament Hebrews, that God had chosen them to do specific things in the world and in the New England wilderness. They were people on a mission, and they would be punished or rewarded as a group as to whether or not they succeeded and followed the plan. So each individual had to follow the group's plan or everyone would be in trouble. So individual liberty and freedom was never the emphasis. The success of the community and their messianic project was. And they landed in Massachusetts Bay, and they quickly absorbed the old colony of the Pilgrims on Cape Cod and the Royalist settlements at Sir Ferdinando Gorges, a eccentric feudal knight had set up on the coast of Maine, including down this way, and then pulled New Hampshire and Connecticut into their orbit. And then, when the Dutch, who had settled at the mouth of the Hudson River in what's now New York City and worked their way up the Hudson Valley, when the Dutch were defeated in an Anglo-Dutch war in the 1670s, that suddenly created a problem because the colony that had been New Netherland became New York. And that was named after the king's brother, the Duke of York. It was to be a proprietary colony belonging to him. But Massachusetts raised their hand and said, wait a minute, we have an objection. And that objection was this. You probably remember from your history text when you were in middle school, the 13 colonies, right? The 13 colonies kind of looked on the map like the 13 states do now, except a number of them would have these strange appendages that extended like a colony-wide appendage going all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. Now, what was up with that? Well, their land, title, the grants they had been given for the land for their colony would say, hey, this colony starts at that willow tree over there, and it ends over at this old bucket, and then extends to the next ocean, wherever it is to the west. We don't know where it is, but wherever it is, we own everything from here to there. And so all of these colonies had these gigantic strips extending to an ocean that was much more distant from the Atlantic than they thought. Massachusetts had one of these claims, and so they stood up when New Netherland was defeated and said, wait a minute, we own a Massachusettsian-wide strip of upstate New York, millions and millions of acres extending all along. Here it is in our paperwork. Well, like I said, the Duke of York was to possess this colony, so they lost that argument. They would not have sovereignty over the disputed areas of upstate New York, but by way of compensation, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts received land title to all that land, which they then officially gave Massachusetts-based land companies the right to go settle it. And they often moved, these settlement companies. They would be led by a Presbyterian or Congregational minister and much of his flock from a particular town, coming in family units and redeploying and unpacking New England-style villages all through this area of upstate New York, which is why if you go to much of upstate New York and you drive into a town to the old part, it resembles the New England model, right? Town green, meeting house, courthouse, and so on, all assembled in a sort of nucleated village model. Same thing if you go on and you advance into the early 19th century when the Ohio Territory was being created out of the old Northwest Territory. This time, when Ohio was created, Connecticut raised their hand and said, wait a second, we own a Connecticutian-wide strip. That's the dark blue you see along Lake Erie. It's the Western Reserve of Connecticut. Same thing happened. Connecticut, they said, yeah, no, Ohio's going to have sovereignty. Connecticut, you can actually have land title and settle this land, which is why if you pull out your Google Maps or your Rand McNally Atlas and you look at that part of Connecticut and only that part, that part of Ohio and only that part, many of the towns have place names from Connecticut because that's where the original settlers were from. The other parts of Ohio were settled by people from completely different areas. Go on to Michigan, and when Michigan was created a generation later, many of the first settlers came from the northern parts of Maine, where the 19th century technologies of industrial forestry were created, and they were moved to be the lumberjacks in Michigan. And the leadership class, the people who came and assembled to write the state constitution at the convention, who were in the territorial legislature, who created the institutions and ideas through which Michigan would be governed, were the 5 of the first six territorial and state governors were from the Yankee-settled Western Reserve of Ohio, the Yankee-settled upstate of New York, or New England itself. And then same story for Wisconsin and Minnesota thereafter. In other words, the early people came and kind of formatted the hard drive. All of the stuff that anthropologists think of as culture were sort of laid down by these early settlement groups, and everyone else encountered it as a bit of a fait accompli. And the sticking elements of those early ideas and ideologies you can still see the echoes of today in all kinds of things that we'll show in just a moment. So that's what this map represents. It's just settlement patterns. And I could tell you another story about each one of those regional cultures, but that's what you're actually seeing mapped. Nothing else in there. So these different regional cultures don't agree on a lot of important things. They don't agree, for instance, on how to create a society where humans can be maximally and sustainably free. How do you do it? Do you emphasize individual liberty, as the Scots-Irish-inflected warrior culture of Greater Appalachia does, or the common good, as did the Puritans, with that belief that they were in that covenanted Old Testament relationship with God and tasked to collectively build a more godly society on the American frontier? In other words, is freedom ultimately about maximizing the autonomy of the individual, about personal sovereignty and lack of constraints, especially, but not exclusively, from government? If we had less government and less taxes and less regulations, is it not axiomatic that each of us would be more free? Or Is it that freedom is about building and maintaining the infrastructure and institutions of a free society? The schools and parks, roads and bridges, public universities, libraries and clinics that act as a leveling mechanism to ensure that each person has a fair shot at achieving their potential of being meaningfully free, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. In other words, is it a shared endeavor, a social project, the cultivation of a Republican citizenry? The answer, laid out in American Character, is that an optimally functioning liberal democracy maintains a balance between these two essential aspects of freedom, right? To have them in equilibrium. If you go off in the extreme in either direction, you're going to end up in tyranny, an oligarchical form or an Orwellian form. And if that's the case, somewhere in between, logically, there's a point where the two are in balance and your liberal democracy, small l, small d, is firing on all cylinders. Different countries, though, have a different balance point. Japan's is not Australia's. And our problem as a federation, like I just described, is that the regional cultures each have very different ideas about where the balance point lies, or even if there should be a balance point at all. And that's meant that our federal politics, up until 2016 at least, centered on this question of individual liberty or the common good, which is why you see that map reflected in so many others, like county-level election results. I haven't messed with the colors. This is the 1916 presidential map, Woodrow Wilson versus Charles Hughes, where Republicans, yes, in red, were the party of communitarian values, and the Democrats, in blue, were then the party of individual liberty and racial apartheid. Notice that the communitarian cultures like Yankeedom, which includes New Netherland and the left coast, are backing one side, and the individualistic cultures, including the Deep South, Greater Appalachia, and Far West, are with the latter. You can see it right down to the Western Reserve of Ohio and left coast banking out against the others, and a monochrome in a single color throughout the Tidewater and Deep South. And this is the 2008 map, Barack Obama versus John McCain. Same map pretty much, except the colors have reversed, because by this time, the two major parties had reversed their platforms, ideologies, and regional constituencies. And, as you can see, that there's no longer a monochrome single color in the Deep South and Tidewater. And you can also see El Norte popping up there. That's because Latinos and African Americans could finally actually exercise the franchise, as they could not back when Woodrow Wilson was running. This also affects all sorts of things that go well beyond politics. For instance, the response to a contagious, deadly airborne virus. You can see how the individual liberty nations hobbled the US response to the COVID-19 pandemic, resisting mask wearing and vaccines, mapped here at Nationhood Lab by nation, as of August 15th, 2021, a time when vaccines had been freely available for many weeks. Some of the communitarian nations at that time had almost double the per capita vaccination level of the Deep South. And not unrelated, here from the New York Times, are per capita COVID-19 deaths from the previous summer, the vaccineless summer, when survival meant following lockdown advice and ordinances and wearing masks and all the rest. Enormous differences. The darker the shade is, the more deaths there were per capita. The lightest shade is under 20, and the darkest shades are well over 100. You can see these regional divides, however, in the prevalence of various other diseases. Here's diabetes prevalence from the CDC data as processed by my team and our academic collaborators at the universities of Minnesota and Illinois, Chicago. As you can see, the Deep South and Greater Appalachia have a problem in this regard. And this is obesity. These maps, by the way, are all generated at Nationhood Lab. This one is of life expectancy. As my project revealed in a Politico story I wrote last year, we found 3 to 5 year differences on a population level between the large regions. Now that may not sound like a lot, but that's the gap that separates the United States from Bulgaria, Libya, and the Philippines. And those gaps didn't just go away when we parsed by race or urbanity or the impoverishment of the county, or the education level of the county, or access to quality health care by metrics set independently by other research groups. This, from the Washington Post, are FICO credit scores by county. Blue is bad and gold is good. Now consider, there are a lot of very, very wealthy countries in that blue blob. And there's some really, really poor ones in the gold, like Washington County in easternmost Maine, which I think has the lowest per capita income in the entire Northeast. And yet, compare Cleveland up in the north of Ohio with Cincinnati, suburbs and all. How can that be? I don't know, but there's clearly something culturally going on there. Also little appreciated is how much the incidence of gun violence, like so many salient issues in American life, vary by region. Here, using CDC data again, we mapped the per capita rate for gun deaths by county between 2010 and 2020 cumulative. The Deep South's annual per capita rate of 15.6 per 100,000 residents is about double that of Yankeedom's, and 4 times that of New Netherland, Greater New York City, whose rate of 3.8 per 100,000 isn't much higher than Switzerland's. The gaps, by the way, persist or grow if you look at just urban counties compared with each other across regions, or just rural ones, or just gun homicides, or just gun suicides, or just white victims, or just black victims. This was a subject of another Politico story I wrote that became their most read story on the site in the first half of 2023. Now, when I show that image on the internet, the thread typically fills up with the trolls with comments that amount to, well, this is just a map of where black people live. Because African American gun homicide rates typically are a decimal place higher than for whites, though their suicide rate is about half that of the white rate. But to dispel the notion that regional cultural effects aren't at play, this is exactly the same exercise, but for whites-only gun deaths. The Deep South's rate is more than double that of Yankeedom's and 5 times that of New Netherlands. Not unrelated, here's every fatal white supremacist mob action in the United States between 1835 and 1964, both lynchings and riots, as mapped by the Monroe Work Today Research Group. The orange dots represent an incident where an African American was killed. The yellow ones are Latino victims. The presence of the regional cultures also profoundly affected 19th century immigration. This, from the Census Bureau, is the percentage of foreign-born people in 1900 by county, right during the great immigration wave of 1880 to 1924. Notice that nobody came to the Deep South, Tidewater, and Greater Appalachia in that wave, right? The Deep South is 1.3% of the population was foreign-born then. Tidewater, 1.1, while the left coast and Yankeedom are in the mid-20s, and New Netherland is over 30% foreign-born. That's quite an enormous change, and it reinforced identity and demographic differences between the regions rather than make them less so. And it affected the distribution of religious traditions today. Here, from the Association of Statisticians of American Religious Bodies' U.S. Religion Census, are the dominant religions by county today. Red is Southern Baptist. You can see a green Methodist belt going through the Midlands. Gray is the Latter-day Saints or Mormons. And blue is Catholic, the largest religious group amid that great 1880 to 1924 immigration wave that so profoundly changed American ideas about identity, forcing legacy Protestant America, kicking and screaming, to accept that henceforth Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Jews, at least, would be full-fledged Americans too, except none of that happened in those southern regions. That Baptist zone there is the legacy of the spatial distribution of that great immigration wave, the only part of the country where Christian nationalism, the notion that America is rightly an evangelical Protestant nation created for evangelical Protestants, can find fertile soil, because it's obviously not the case on the ground in the other regional cultures and hasn't been for going on 6 and 7 generations. Here is a detailed crowdsourced map of American dialects today by the internet researcher Rick Ashman, which, like many of these other data sets, appeared many years after I wrote American Nations. Now, what he did was he said, hey, here's my website, click on it, speak this, tell me your zip code and speak this speech. And then, being a linguist, they did their diphthongs and sorted everything out and just mapped it as to the way people are talking today, despite everyone moving around. And the large, thick blue lines are the dominant, sort of kingdoms of dialects in the US today. Notice the degree to which they follow those same settlement patterns, which makes sense when you think about it. And most to my surprise, it even affects genetics, right? American Nations is all about cultural transmission, not genetics at all. But this study, which came out in 2017 in the journal Nature Communications, it came from scientists at Ancestry.com, the people that you give your Q-tip to and you swipe your nose and you send it in. They sequence your genome and tell you, oh, geez, I'm not Lithuanian. That's not my father, right? But if you check the box that said you can use this for research, and about 770,000 Americans had at the time that this paper was created, they would feed all of those sequenced genomes and they'd tell the supercomputer, look at every single one of these 770,000 and just find the ones that are strangely related or unusually clustered. And then, because it's Ancestry.com, they also have your family tree, so they know that your maternal great-grandmother was born in this town and then moved to that one. So they could spatially map the reproductive clusters back in time, and they created that map, which, of course, everyone started emailing me who knew American Nations. I contacted the people who wrote it. They'd never heard anything about it, but to a great degree, even the big decision, like who are you going to, create a new generation with, ended up following these settlement pattern lines, with Greater Appalachia breaking on the two sides of the Appalachian Mountain Range. They all started in south central Pennsylvania. One group went down the Great Wagon Road to settle the uplands of the south and on into the Ozarks and Texas Hill Country, and the others on the other side of the mountains went through western Virginia and Kentucky and rafted down the Ohio River to settle the lower parts of the lower Great Lakes states. So that was a surprise even to me that it would extend out and have that effect at this point. So my point is that the divides are real, they're persistent, and they matter. So that brings us to the second topic and question of tonight's presentation. Given all that, what holds us together? What's ever held us together? Because the regional cultures, the 6 Eastern ones anyway, wound up together in an accident of history. They'd come together in 1776 to face off a common threat, a change in British imperial policy that threatened to destroy the relative autonomy of each of their individual political and social systems. Now, to stave off this threat, they formed a joint military command in the form of the Continental Army and a treaty organization, the Continental Congress, which moved its meetings around the map as the front lines shifted to try to stay in safety. And miraculously, they won. And they found themselves inside something called the United States of America, except nobody knew exactly what that was. The United States had come into being as a contractual agreement, a means to an ends for the parties involved. Nobody at the time had thought that they had just created a nation state in the sense that Holland or Prussia or post-revolutionary France were. Its people lacked a shared history, religion, or ethnicity. They didn't speak a unique language all their own. They hadn't occupied the continent long enough to have some sense of dwelling in a mythic homeland since time immemorial, and they'd pushed off or killed the very people who could make such a claim and were often still doing so. They lacked a shared political heritage, apart from the imperial ties that they had just revolted against. And they had no shared story of who they were and what their purpose was together. In other words, they had none of the foundations of a nation state. They needed that story to pull them together. And that story had to be created decades later, starting in the 1830s, really, a story I told in my most recent book, Union. It's the one thing that's held us together more or less ever since, but it's been contested from the start. Today, the regional fissures I outlined are having a corrosive effect on that story, which is a shared loyalty to the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence, the inherent equality of humans, their rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and access to representative self-government. And when those ideals are under threat, the United States has little to fall back on. This is a very important point. The fate of the Republic and the Federation are one and the same. If the Republic falls, The Union will follow shortly thereafter. Now, such stories, such national narratives, are required of every nation, be it Germany or Hungary or Japan or ourselves. Because as individuals, think about it, to feel fealty to something as abstract as a nation, to feel that we owe it greater loyalty than to others, that we are bound to its fellow members more than we are to people who are not members, that we might indeed ultimately give our lives to it, that requires a genuinely compelling and credible story, an idea that's evocative and feels true on some level, that has footings in the past and gives us an answer for why we're together. A society without such a credible story, the historian William McNeill wrote 35 years ago, soon finds itself in deep trouble, for in the absence of believable myths, coherent public action becomes very difficult to improvise or to sustain. So the story of United States nationhood, of who belonged and what the purpose was and where it came from and where it was all going, had to be created ex post facto. And by the time we really got around to doing so in the 1830s and 1840s, there were two stories competing with one another. Two stories of America that could not coexist. A contest over identity and purpose that has continued to this day. Now, one story said, yes, we may lack a shared history or religion or ethnicity, but what we share are a set of ideals, those ones I mentioned before in that famous passage in our opening statement as a people, the Declaration of Independence. And to be an American is to be committed to this set of propositions about the nature of the universe. In this tradition, first packaged and promoted by a Massachusetts Yankee, the historian statesman George Bancroft in the 1830s, argued that America's purpose is to create a society dedicated to making these ideals a reality, and that Americans' purpose is to fight for these ideals and for one another being able to secure them. Now, these are pretty good ideals. A natural right granted to all humans by God or nature, or as the Declaration says, nature's God, to survive, to not be tyrannized, to pursue our happiness as we each understand it, and to have equal access to the representative self-government that makes it all possible. And that we're in a covenant as Americans to protect one another's rights to these things. Now, these are the ideals that Frederick Douglass fought for in every speech he gave. This is Lincoln at Gettysburg and Martin Luther King on the Mall. It's our civic national ideal, the American promise. But it was contested immediately, in real time, from the 1830s onward, by a counter-narrative crafted by a circle of Southern intellectuals who said, no, the Declaration and Jefferson are wrong. Humans are obviously not created equal. Only the Anglo-Saxon race, they argued, had the genius and ability to secure the promises in the Declaration. We are, they said, a classical republic, like ancient Greece and Rome, where a minority have the privilege or liberty to practice democracy, and subjugation and slavery are the natural lot of the many. It's the only way a republic could exist, they said. It was an ethno-national and inherently authoritarian vision. Now, the battle between these two versions of America has been our eternal struggle. This was the fight throughout the antebellum period, and in the Civil War, and Reconstruction. The ethno-nationalists actually ruled this country federation-wide in the 1910s and 1920s, when the first deep Southern president, Woodrow Wilson, segregated the federal government, when they were putting up the Confederate statues that we're now tearing down, when Birth of a Nation, the Hollywood hit, the film that literally created Hollywood, was all the rage. This is the actual movie poster, celebrating the Ku Klux Klan's successful terrorist campaign to restore white supremacy in the occupied South. When the 1924 Immigration Act imposed racial quotas explicitly to defend the Anglo-Saxon character of the country. The civic national vision only triumphed federation-wide for the first time in the 1960s, the result of the mass mobilizations in the world wars, the civil rights movements that those returning African American and Native American and Latino vets helped spearhead, and the interventions of the federal government at key moments, because the existence of a formal racial apartheid system in the American South was providing the Soviets with powerful and true propaganda to win the hearts and minds of people in the primary battlefields of the Cold War, what we now call the Global South, but was then called the Third World. And so the civil rights movement toppled Southern apartheid and challenged Northern racism. The feminist movement demanded social, professional, and sexual equality for a gender that comprised the majority of the population. Gays and lesbians fought the police and discriminatory ordinances. Elite colleges began partially dismantling their old boys networks, and public universities rapidly expanded to increase educational opportunities. Congress passed a new immigration law in 1964 that repealed the ethno-national quotas, reopening America's gates to humanity at large. And a new generation of historians challenged the neo-Confederate narrative of American history that by then had dominated scholastic textbooks for half a century, while dispelling the innocence of the American colonization of the continent. And so the civic national narrative returned to the fore. And that's when we became what political scientists would call a liberal democracy, small l, small d. Not in the 1860s, in the 1960s. In other words, in living memory. There's nothing inevitable about it. It's an incredible gift that had to be fought for and continues to be fought for. Because the forces of autocracy and ethno-nationalism have never gone away. And they're around. And they have their narrative all worked out, the story of the kind of country they're fighting for. Make America great again, like it was before that civic national triumph. The rest of us don't have our story worked out. We, and by that I mean the 70 to 80% of Americans who, if they really stopped and thought about it, and polling shows this, don't want to live in an authoritarian world. The rest of us, that supermajority, have lost our story and our message. And we were never really very good at talking about it. What do those civil ideals mean in practice? What's a natural right to the pursuit of happiness mean? But we stopped even trying to articulate it after the Cold War. And a vacuum opened up, and demagogues stepped right in like they always do. We need that story now. Not only because democracy really is better than an authoritarian regime, but also because the consolidation of one of those would almost certainly trigger the physical collapse of the Federation. And so that's the work we're doing at Nationhood Lab right now, the testing, polling, and crafting of an emotive, weaponized, if you will, American story. That answer for why we should stay together and why we all belong and where we ought to be going. One that can be used in ordinary conversations and in real-world situations. One that can rally that latent supermajority to defend what should have been America's ideals and values for all of the past 248 years. We're perfecting that story, a story of pride and reckoning, of an effort to create a society where all people can be meaningfully free, and we'll be helping to deploy it by putting it in the hands of organizations working to reform civic education, to engage Hollywood producers and television showrunners to bring these themes into their creative mix, to help business leaders grapple with what values their institutions really can't do without, to political leaders, Republicans, Democrats, independents, or whatever, as long as they share a commitment to that American experiment, to organizations working to field and protect the vote, like the 700 chapters of the League of Women Voters distributed across the country, or to the 250th anniversary commissions in each of the 50 states tasked with helping commemorate the anniversary of the country and the Declaration itself in 2026. And indeed, into the hands of all of you. We're a public library shelf. Now, we're in the midst of our polling and quantitative work assessment right now, but our preliminary national baseline poll, completed back in April, was very encouraging. We asked registered voters which statements about the nature of the United States they most agreed with. We offered statement pairs throughout about our national purpose, American identity, the meaning of our past, and in each case, one of these statement pairs was keyed off the ideals in the Declaration, and the other was rooted in more intrinsic characteristics, like ancestry, or heritage, and character, and values. I wrote each to sound as attractive as possible, and I actually expected that when the poll results came back, that the heritage character versions would win, if only because they seemed more concrete and real than pledging loyalty to these abstract and kind of cloudy ideals. But the civic ones turned out to be far more attractive, and were so across all these segments: gender, age, race, education, and region. 63% of Americans preferred the statement that we are united, quote, not by a shared religion or ancestry or history, but by our shared commitment to a set of American founding ideals, that we all have inherent and equal rights to live, to not be tyrannized, and to pursue happiness as we each understand it. Over one embraced by only 33% of respondents that said we are united, quote, by shared history, traditions, and values, and by our fortitude and character as Americans, a people who value hard work, individual responsibility, and national loyalty. Now, I put some crosstabs up here. Green is preference for the civic vision, yellow for the heritage/ethno-national constructions. The former was the overwhelming favorite for most everyone, with two major exceptions: Republicans and those who said they voted for Trump in 2020. But still, 45% of respondents from both of those segments preferred the declaration, joining 63% of independents and 79% of self-identified Democrats. As a starting point, as a baseline, before we'd even tried to work any messaging magic, those were very encouraging numbers, much more so than we were expecting. We just last week completed the last round of polling, and we're digesting that now, but I can share a few early lessons from that. First, we wanted to test if Americans agree with that argument, grounded in a logic-based analysis of the Declaration, that we are duty-bound as Americans to protect one another's natural rights to life and liberty, and so on. And they do, by a staggering 97-2 margin, one of the widest our pollsters said they had ever seen in any question they had ever asked. So people say they believe in the Declaration's values. They believe in liberal democracy. But do they actually act on these beliefs when the going gets tough? Well, to get at that, we asked a series of questions about real-world scenarios where these natural rights propositions were clearly under assault. When it came to aggressive book bans, governments trying to force public libraries, not school libraries, public ones, to remove titles some people found offensive under the threats of funding cuts or eviction, pretty much everyone was opposed. Same, broadly speaking, for election subversion, refusing to certify a fraud-free election because your party had lost. Though in both cases, notice that Republicans support at the bottom bar, the dark blue colors are supportive and the yellow colors are opposition. The gray is don't know or want more information. Republican support is a bit softer in both of those areas. And then, when you move forward, there's this. The top slide asked, hey, are you okay with lawmakers from your party eliminating election day voter registration explicitly because they believe it will suppress turnout for the other party's supporters? These are all real-world things that happen, by the way. Overall, 61% of Americans strongly or somewhat oppose this. But look at those partisan splits. Republicans support partisan vote suppression by an 8-point margin. Independents oppose it by 36, and Democrats by 77. And the bottom slide asks, hey, are you okay with the Supreme Court saying that presidents are above the law, that they can't be held accountable for crimes committed as an official act? Justice Sotomayor, in her dissent in the case, noted that under this definition, a president ordering SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political opponent would be okay because it's an official act. Republicans support this ruling by 67-16, a staggering 51-point margin, while Democrats oppose it by a near universal 93-3, a 90-point margin, joined by independents at a 29-point margin. So the point is, there's still lots of work to be done. And the stats and all the polling we saw is that the problem is in fact concentrated on the American right. Thus, our work in perfecting an effective message, a compelling story of U.S. civic nationhood, that's why it's so important. And we're at work now optimizing the language now to roll out at the beginning of the 250th. Now you might say, hey, you'll never convince everyone, and that's true. Polling and data from all sorts of countries, including our own, shows that 10 to 20% of people out there really are all in on a heritage, tradition, character, not just a heritage, tradition, and character point of view, but sort of full-blown ethno-national authoritarianism. There's something in the human distribution in the population of how the mind works that likes that idea, but it's only actualized in certain historical contexts and situations. People who generally relish the public promises of their leader to assign active duty military forces to domestic law enforcement duties, to pardon convicted insurrectionists and other criminals en masse, to investigate and jail critics and political rivals on trumped-up charges, to purge the civil service and stack it with people whose loyalty is to the leader, not the people, the country, or the law, to use the Insurrection Act to crush protesters. A world where reporters, public officials, election workers, and anyone deemed to be vermin would be physically threatened and attacked. A world where elections will no longer be settled by voters, but by the machinations of the regime. The 10 or 20% who genuinely support this agenda will in fact reject the narrative I've proposed because they reject the American experiment. And it's true that many more won't want to listen or hear, committed to their tribal identity, the safety and comfort of an information bubble, or love of the leader. But some will. And to protect democracy in the next few years, in a country poised on a knife edge, 5 or 7% of the people asleep at the wheel, unaware of the stakes and the threat to something they actually value, would be decisive. And in the middle and long term, I believe the wind is at our backs, the backs of an omnipartisan, anti-authoritarian supermajority. Because I have Gen Z and Gen Alpha kids, and their generations and the millennials are not on board for authoritarian ethno-nationalism. And our polling, along with everyone else's, has showed that as well. There's a massive generational gap in all of these kinds of questions. And as their electoral power rapidly grows in the coming decade, that threat to our country will recede, and we can get on to addressing the core problems that got us here in the first place. But we do have to have free and fair elections during that period. So I invite you to follow our work as it continues in the coming years, as it unfolds at nationhoodlad.org, and I look forward, most of all, to answering your questions now. Thank you.